Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 308 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm your host, Danièle Cybulskie. One of the difficult truths of life in the medieval world is that death was never far away. And while the vast majority of medieval people owned far fewer possessions than we do today, they were just as concerned with making sure everything was taken care of according to their wishes before they passed. To that end, many people created last wills and testaments, leaving behind clear instructions for their communities and a treasure trove of information for historians. This week, I spoke with Robert A. Wood about medieval wills and testaments. Robert is an independent scholar who has created a treasure trove of his own in the form of his book, Wills and Testaments in Medieval England from the 13th to the 16th Century. Our conversation on medieval wills, funerals, and some memorable bequests is coming up right after this. Well, thank you, Robert, for coming to talk to me about wills and testaments. We've already had a good chat, but it's time to get started.
Yes.
Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
That's a pleasure.
Okay, so your book is called Wills and Testaments. So before we get into all sorts of stuff, what's the difference between a will and a testament? I think most of us don't really know.
The testament concerns the disposition of movable goods, whereas the last will is concerned with immovable goods, which is basically land and buildings. So there's two distinct things about it. Now, the problem, according to both canon law and common law, was that the church courts who were responsible for granting the probate to the testament were unable to deal with the last will, in other words, the property. How most medieval testators got around the problem was they would say, I make this my last will and testament. So that meant then that the details were actually recorded by the scribes in one of the diocesan registries, so that you have got details of both all the personal goods and effects, as well as things like property and who got what and so on. So that's how medieval people got round that, and church managed to keep it all going, put it that way.
Well, it makes sense to me to put it all in the same document.
Yeah. And it makes it easier for us as historians as well.
Because it's all neatly together.
Yeah.
So when are people writing their wills? Are they writing them the second they get married, for example? When are they writing them?
The majority of the wills were drawn up at or near to death. It was the sort of system that in many cases, what one sees in these documents doesn't necessarily mean that was all the material which the testators had, because quite often gifts were given to family members before the demise of the testator. But invariably, wills and testaments, they were drawn up probably within anywhere between about a week to 2 weeks before the actual demise of the testator. They also wanted to emphasize that they were of good memory and compos mentis, because if they were not compos mentis, then in theory they couldn't make a will, because church courts couldn't agree to what was sort of put in there. There aren't any surviving wills like that. So if someone was not of sound mind and good memory, then they weren't allowed to make a will.
So before we get into the contents of wills, I think we need to talk about the funeral, because so much of the stuff in the wills has to do with the funeral. So
Yes.
Someone has written a will,
Yeah.
then they've died. What does the funeral involve in the Middle Ages?
What the funeral involves is that there would be the commendation for the soul. There'd also be the place of burial, which was quite important. Now, depending on social status, if you were of the gentry class, or whatever, then you would expect to be buried somewhere before the high altar. But if you were a parish rector, then you would be expected to be buried in the chancel of his church. But there were also other places where was indeed more efficacious, and that is either at the gate or at the entrance into the church, where people coming through would actually say a prayer on behalf of the deceased. But coming to the ritual of the funeral itself, it followed the process of the Requiem Mass. The day before the interment and the saying of the Requiem, they would have a Vespers for the services of the dead by saying the placebo, which is based on the antiphon which begins placebo, so-and-so and so-and-so. And then on the day of the burial itself, the body would be sewn in a sheet or a shroud, but with no coffin, and was carried into the church on a bier, which is basically wooden boards. Over the bier was placed a triangle called the hearse, which was made either of wood or a metal frame, in which they were then designed to hold candles. Now, the bier would be surrounded by torches and tapers. In the following morning, they would sing the dirige, which again was based on another antiphon of the whole of the Requiem Mass itself. And it was when you would have all the mourners, all the family. You would quite often have poor men and women, usually dressed in black or russet, carrying torches, because it was felt that prayers from the indigent poor were more efficacious for the testator's soul on its journey from death through purgatory into paradise. After that, there would be the Requiem Mass itself, where mourners would make gifts of money. Then the burial would take place. There would also be ringing of bells and so on and so forth. So it was a real ritual. But if testators could afford it, then there would be a reenactment of the funeral with an empty bier, but complete with the hearse and candles and mourners as well, which could take place either on the 7th or the 30th day after the interment. So you would have the same funeral service as on the actual day of the burial. And again, you would have your mourners, and there would be money given to the poor and so on and so forth. And then sometimes, depending on the wealth, there would be another service on the anniversary of the death. So as you can see, it was designed for what John Bossy called, it was prayers of the living in the service of the dead. So it was a reminder that the dead were with them all the time.
It's very different from today in that you might have one priest, one minister, one funeral director. And so this is very involved, which is why you have to make such accommodations for it in a will.
Yes.
All right. So we have an idea of the funeral.
Yeah.
So let's get back around to what do people put in their wills and testaments? We talked a little bit about how they have to say that they're of sound mind when they're doing this. What else do they put in their wills?
Right. What else do they normally put in? Obviously, they put their name, sometimes their social status. They put the date of the will. They then make dedication for their soul, which is usually to God, my Saviour or Creator, the Blessed Virgin Mary, his mother, Jesus Christ, and all the saints in heaven. Sometimes if a testator has a particular feeling about a particular saint, that would then be added as well. So after the invocation, they would then go on to the place of burial. Normally it would be either in their parish church or churchyard. Sometimes, particularly in London, some of the parishes did not have churchyards, so they often were buried in St. Paul's churchyard, but others, in the main, they chose their parish church or churchyard. There was then the bequests to the clergy. The main one was for tithes and oblations, which were taxes which had to be paid to the church. And the donations would often say, and I give to the high altar 10 marks for my tithes and oblations negligently forgotten.
I love that.
But the implication being that the money to the high altar would actually go to the rector. He got that as well. Mm-hmm. But then they also made additional bequests to the parish clergy. So you have people like the chaplains, you have clerks who were probably lay members, but some were in holy orders. And they would ask for prayers to be said on the day of the burial, but also sometimes they would leave money to chaplains for a particular time to say prayers for themselves, their wives, their departed, their forebears, people who they say were bound to pray for, and the universal phrase of, and all the faithful departed. So that was that. And then the next phase would be donations to the church, like money left for the high altar, money left for other altars, which could either be money or gifts. Things like items of jewellery are often put round statues, mainly to the Virgin, but also to other saints as well. But also, if you were someone like Thomas Spring, the merchant in Lavenham, who was probably the most wealthy commoner below the crown, and his income was on a par with dukes, so he was extremely wealthy. And I go into that in detail in the book. And he left a lot of money for the rebuilding of the tower of his parish church, dedicated to St. Peter and Paul. And to emphasise his importance, he also had his merchant's mark, which you can see all over the tower and all over the porch. He also provided money for a parclo screen, which could either be of stone or timber. And this was put around where he was buried, which was before the image of St. Catherine on the north aisle of Lavenham Church. And the parclo screen still survives, and there is a photograph of that within the book. There's also the palimpsest of his tomb as well, the brass long removed by the iconoclasts during the interregnum. But it would have been himself and his wife or wives. He was an exception. Another one was Sir John Heveningham, who was a knight, Suffolk knight, of a long and distinguished family, and he provided money for a new aisle on the north side of the church, where he was buried with other of his ancestors. I think he made a sum of about £100 for that.
Which is quite a lot.
Well, these are exceptions within, which I sort of highlighted within the book. If you had that sort of wealth, then these are the things which you could do. And it shows a degree of piety which was carried out during their lifetimes. Although in the case of Thomas Spring III, Thomas was dead, but he set aside that amount of money. And he was the third generation, all Thomas Springs. So his grandfather and father also contributed to the rebuilding of Lavenham Church. And it is a spectacular, it's a wall church, and most of East Anglian churches were rebuilt during the 15th century on the wealth of wall that the merchants generated.
Mm-hmm.
So
I think it makes a lot of sense to people that you'd be giving to the church to make sure that your soul is taken care of. But one of the things that I think is really interesting about wills in particular is the way that people give to the public works. So
yes.
Prisoners are one place where people will give money, but also to the public works. So what kind of works do people fund through their wills, through their bequests?
Well, public works were also considered an act of piety. So you have things like the repair of roads,
mm-hmm.
also the repair of bridges, the introduction of piped water supplies.
Public latrines. That was one that I saw in another will another time.
Yes, that's true, yes. Public convenience as well. And also the setting up of marketplaces. there are lots of things which they could do. And of course, all this was to help speed their soul through purgatory.
Yes. One thing that you have noticed in looking at all these wills and testaments is that there is a difference between men's wills and women's wills. What is the difference that you spotted?
Well, the main difference is that the majority of women's wills were made by widows. So therefore, their wills are more detailed than men's wills. Men's wills tended to be dealing with the details of, reparations for the church and so on and so forth. In other words, so that they would have all these benefits of prayers and things for their soul and so on. And they would also remember their wives and children. But quite often what they had done in their lifetimes, I think we touched on it before, was they would have already made some preparations for the wife and the children before drawing up their wills. In the case of medieval women, most were widows, so with the death of their husbands, they lost that real close connection. So they looked towards their immediate family relations, sons, daughters, brothers, sisters, and a wider network of friends and neighbours, and they took comfort within that. And you can see by the level of detail of their bequests that they made, you can get some idea of the closeness of the recipient to the testator. So you get things like, I live to Joan of Stanning Lane, my best rosary, and my second best gown, and so on. So you get a gradation of gifts depending on the closeness of the individual who is receiving it. Always, of course, with all these bequests that we've been discussing, it was always implied or accepted that there would be reciprocal prayers for the soul in receipt of the gifts. The whole doctrine of purgatory was such that the more you could get people praying for you by disposing of gifts and so on and so forth, the speedier your journey would be to the afterlife and reach heaven, which was what they all aspired to. Whether they actually did or not, we never know.
Yes, that's kind of too bad. It would be interesting to find out what the end of the story is, but that is the human condition.
Yeah, that's right.
So interestingly, you have a few examples in here of anchorites. You have an anchorite and a hermit in here. What would they need a will for?
Well, anchorites were they women, or could also be clergy, who chose to lead the enclosed life. And to become an anchorite, they had to go before either the archdeacon or the archdeacon's commissary and put forward why they wished to do so. They also had to provide details of what they brought with them, what money they had, and how they would have the ability to collect alms. So they would have servants who would go out and get shopping and collect alms and things. And it allowed them to lead a life of contemplative prayer. If the archdeacon or his commissary was happy with all the provisions, they would then go through a religious ceremony in front of their family where they would be taken down into an enclosure. It was like a burial pit where they would be laid and covered over, and then the space then completely enclosed. They were then divorced from the outside world, which allowed them to lead this life of contemplative prayer. But they could also speak to people from the outside, and people would come and ask for them to say prayers for them as well. Hermits, on the other hand, were mainly, but not always, usually men, and they still lived outside. They could be found doing charitable works like street cleaning, cleaning ditches, mending the battlements, and they could often be found living in the archways of gates into medieval towns and cities. And the example of the hermit that we have in the book, he lived in one of the gates into the town of Norwich, and he was responsible for locking the gates at night and, in the event of any emergency, for ringing the bells. So that is the basic difference between an anchorite and a hermit.
Right. Would they be writing their will before they were enclosed, for example, or are they writing it closer to their deaths?
In both cases, it would be when they were near a death. And again, it would be written and it would be witnessed. And obviously, in the case of the anchorite that I have from London, it was witnessed by her maid, but also by the parish rector of the church. And in the case of the hermit, he also had small items which he needed to be bequeathed, so that, again, that would be witnessed as well.
I just think it's interesting that these people who have the least amount, or they're meant to have the least amount, still are creating wills and testaments to make sure that everyone is taken care of. So we're talking about little things that people will bequeath to other people, especially things that may be special, sentimental. So what are some of the most interesting things that you found in wills that you just, when you're going to a party, you tell people who are asking about your work, this is really interesting, the thing that I found in the documents?
Yeah, I mean, some of the things which I found very interesting, there was this sailor. He was a mariner, William Owener, and he sailed out of the port of Dunwich, which at the time was the second most important port after London. He was on a ship in Iceland at the time when his will was non-cupated, so he dictated it. And there was various items of fishing equipment which he left to his wife and to his children. And he also made provisions for his cabin boy. He was given money and he was given a new suit of clothes for high days, for church days, as well as his work days. That I found was very interesting. One of the other ones, it concerns Sir John Heveningham, and apart from his gifts to his son in the building of his chapel on the north side of his church of Heveningham, he left a number of bequests to the orders of minoresses in the Abbey of Brugard in Suffolk, which was not very far away from his ancestral home. And the reason for that was one of his aunts, Anne, was actually a nun herself at Brugard Abbey. And his other aunt, Margaret, who was the eldest daughter of his grandfather's children, she was an heiress in her own right, and he made substantial bequests to her. And we also have her will, which I've written a paper on, which came out in 2023 in an edition of the Guardian. It's a memorial volume in memory of Anne Sutton, who was another superb scholar. She also left monies for the minoresses, and there is a tradition within the Heveningham family that the female nuns received more money in comparison to the male monks. And I suppose the one that I really like is concerned in Walter Suffield's will, which was very extensive. And apart from leaving £100 to found the Hospital of St Giles in honour of his misdeeds, there was a personal bequest to a William de Whitewell, who was one of Walter's ecclesiastical compatriots. And it says, "To my well-beloved William, I leave him my great belt to be fastened around him when he grows old." And I thought that was really lovely. And it made me smile.
Yes, because that's the sort of thing that we read all these wills and testaments. That's the sort of thing you're looking for, right?
Yes.
That moment of real connection.
That's right. And there are lots of nuggets in that, that can be found. But that one particularly stands out for me.
Well, I think that your book is full of these nuggets and you've made it so clear where to find them. I really think that this is a book that people are going to find useful again and again. And I just want to thank you for coming on the podcast and telling us all about it.
Well, thank you, Danielle. It's been a real pleasure.
To find out more about Robert's book, you can take a quick peek at its review in Volume 100 of Speculum, a journal of medieval studies. Or you can just pick up a copy for yourself. The book is called Wills and Testaments in Medieval England from the 13th to the 16th century. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's up this week, Peter?
Hey. So earlier this month was a big day for the Museum of the Viking Age in Oslo, Norway.
Okay, what happened?
So they moved that famous Osborg ship into that museum as they're getting ready for its opening. It was originally in another museum about 350 feet away, and they moved it very slowly to the new one.
Are you saying they didn't sail it?
That'd even be better if they did. They should have made a canal.
Can't imagine the pressure trying to move that thing.
It took 10 hours to move it 350 feet.
Well, I mean, it's worth it. It's worth it to put the time in and do it right.
Yeah, that Museum of the Viking Age is going to open in 2027. From the images I've seen so far and the plans that have been released, it's going to look amazing.
That is definitely something to look forward to.
Indeed. So we have that, plus we have a piece by Laura Chevalier, who writes about an interesting trial that took place in the year 1077.
Mm-hmm.
The King of Castile ordered a trial by combat between two versions of the Christian liturgy. He wanted the Roman rite, but a lot of people in his kingdom wanted the old Mozarabic rite. And he said, let's have two champions fight it out.
And I guess people will have to read the article to find out what happened, right?
Well, I can give you some spoilers.
All right.
First, he put his champion out in a 1-1 combat, and he lost. The champion lost. But that's not the end of it. The king said, hey, let's do another trial, just one trial by fire, and put both of the rites, like the books, into a fire and see which one burns.
Right. Because that is going to tell the tale.
It probably would have, but the Mozarabic rite survived the first fire.
This is just not going the king's way at all.
No, but the king decided to have enough, and he threw the book back into the fire and said, let the horns of law be bent to the rule of kings.
There you go. And this is why trials by ordeal were phased out, because people were like, you can always kind of tweak them a little bit.
Indeed. And it's also why we have the Roman rite in Spain today.
There you go. Well, thanks, Peter, for stopping by and telling us what's on the website.
Thanks.
Thank you, as always, to all of you for being everyday heroes by listening, sharing, letting the ads play, or becoming patrons on patreon.com. In addition to heaps of good karma, patrons get ad-free episodes as well as huge lists of the latest open access articles in medieval studies each and every month. To find out more or to become a patron, please visit patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from wills to skills, follow medievalist.net on Instagram at medievalistnet or Blue Sky at medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulskie, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5-Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores. Our music is by Christian Overton. Thanks for listening and have yourself an awesome day.